I told myself I was only going because it would have been rude not to. That was the excuse I repeated in my head while I drove through empty streets, the city unusually quiet for that hour. He was my husband's friend, someone I had known for years, someone who had sat at our table, laughed with us, and never crossed a line. That history made the invitation feel safer than it should have, even though the timing alone was enough to make my chest feel tight. When I arrived, he greeted me with a familiar smile, the kind that carried no obvious intention. Still, there was something different in the air, a heaviness I couldn't explain. We talked about ordinary things at first, work, stress, small complaints about life that felt harmless on the surface. But as the minutes passed, the conversation shifted without warning. He asked how I was really doing, not the polite version I offered everyone else. The question caught me off guard, and before I realized it, I was answering honestly. I spoke about feeling invisible in my own marriage, about how my days felt repetitive and emotionally empty. I hadn't planned to say those things. They simply slipped out, as if I had been holding them in for too long. He didn't interrupt or offer quick advice. He listened, his attention steady, making me feel heard in a way I hadn't felt in years. That alone was dangerous, though I didn't want to admit it. There was a pause after I finished speaking, long enough for me to feel exposed. I considered changing the subject, laughing it off, or making an excuse to leave. Instead, I stayed quiet. He spoke then, sharing his own loneliness, his own sense of being stuck in a life that looked complete from the outside but felt hollow inside. Our words began to mirror each other, and that familiarity created a subtle connection I couldn't deny. I noticed small details I had never paid attention to before, the calm in his voice, the way he chose his words carefully, the ease between us. None of it was openly flirtatious, yet it carried a weight that made my heart beat faster. I told myself this was just a conversation, just two people talking late at night. But my thoughts betrayed me. I wondered what it meant that I felt more comfortable there than I did at home. Guilt crept in quietly, not as a sharp warning but as a dull ache. I thought of my husband, unaware of where I was or what I was sharing. I reminded myself that nothing inappropriate had happened, that listening wasn't a betrayal. Still, I felt as though I had already stepped onto unstable ground. Emotional closeness, I realized, could be just as dangerous as physical desire. At one point, our conversation slowed, replaced by silence that felt heavier than words. It wasn't awkward. It was charged, filled with thoughts neither of us voiced. I became acutely aware of the distance between us, close enough to feel but not close enough to touch. That space seemed to shrink without either of us moving. My mind raced with conflicting emotions, curiosity, comfort, fear, and a longing I hadn't expected. I tried to remind myself why I was there, to keep things light, but my focus slipped. His presence felt grounding, yet unsettling. For the first time in a long while, I felt desired, not through compliments or gestures, but through attention. That realization scared me more than anything else. I knew how easily attention could turn into attachment, and attachment into regret. When I finally stood up to leave, relief mixed with disappointment. Part of me was grateful for the chance to escape before anything went too far. Another part felt reluctant, as if I were leaving something unfinished. He walked me to the door, our conversation softer now, more cautious. Nothing happened, and yet everything felt changed. As I stepped back into the night, I understood that the real danger wasn't what had occurred, but what had begun inside me. I had crossed no visible boundary, but the line had shifted all the same. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, and that whatever came next would demand a choice I wasn't ready to make. I told myself I wouldn't go again. That promise lasted only a few days, long enough for the memory of that night to settle into my thoughts and refuse to leave. His messages were brief, careful, never inappropriate, yet each one carried an unspoken meaning. I read them more than once before replying, deleting and rewriting my words until they sounded neutral. I pretended control, even as anticipation quietly took over. When I returned, the familiarity felt unsettling rather than comforting. There was no need for explanations or small talk. We both understood why I was there, even if neither of us said it out loud. The conversation resumed where it had ended before, as if no time had passed at all. That continuity made everything feel intentional, and intention made it harder to deny what was happening. I was more guarded this time, or at least I tried to be. I avoided talking about my marriage, avoided admitting how often I had thought about him since we last spoke. Still, restraint failed me. The way he looked at me, attentive and unhurried, pulled honesty out of me again. I admitted that I had felt restless, distracted, unable to focus on anything without recalling our last conversation. Saying it aloud felt like a confession, one that couldn't be taken back. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he acknowledged it quietly, admitting he felt the same. That mutual recognition changed everything. What had once felt like coincidence now felt like choice. I knew, in that moment, that we were no longer just talking. We were allowing something to grow, fully aware of its consequences. The distance between us disappeared in ways that didn't require movement. Our words slowed, replaced by pauses heavy with meaning. I felt my breath change, my thoughts narrowing until there was little room for reason. I should have left then. The warning was clear enough. Instead, I stayed, telling myself I needed clarity, closure, something that would settle the confusion inside me. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal. He told me he had tried to ignore what he felt, out of respect for my marriage and his friendship with my husband. Hearing that should have reassured me. Instead, it deepened the tension. The fact that he had resisted made the moment feel earned rather than reckless, and that illusion was dangerous. I don't remember deciding to move closer. I only remember becoming aware of how near we were, close enough to feel warmth, close enough to sense hesitation. Time stretched, each second filled with silent questions. Was this the moment everything changed? Was this where I finally stopped pretending? My heart answered before my mind could intervene. The touch was brief, almost accidental, yet it carried the weight of intention. There was nothing forceful about it, nothing dramatic. That was what made it so powerful. I felt a rush of emotion that surprised me, followed instantly by guilt sharp enough to make my chest ache. I pulled back, but the damage was already done. The line I had convinced myself still existed was gone. I tried to rationalize it immediately. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that didn't define me. Yet even as I thought those things, I knew they weren't entirely true. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. I had wanted it. Wanting made me complicit in a way I couldn't escape. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. I expected regret to overwhelm me, but what I felt was more complicated. There was shame, yes, but also a strange sense of relief. I no longer had to wonder what would happen if I let go, because I already knew. That knowledge was both satisfying and terrifying. I stood up abruptly, needing distance, needing air. I told him I had to leave, my voice unsteady despite my effort to sound composed. He didn't try to stop me or make excuses. He simply acknowledged what had happened, not minimizing it, not exaggerating it. That honesty made it harder to walk away, but I did. On the way home, my thoughts raced. I replayed the moment again and again, searching for a version where I could still claim innocence. There wasn't one. I understood then that infidelity didn't begin with physical acts, but with permission. I had given mine willingly, and now I had to live with what that meant. By the time I reached home, I felt changed in a way I couldn't explain. Nothing visible had altered, yet everything felt fragile. I knew this wasn't something I could forget or undo. It had settled into my life quietly, demanding attention. And deep down, I feared that what I had crossed wasn't just a line between loyalty and betrayal, but a point of no return. The days that followed felt heavier than they should have. I moved through my routine on instinct, doing everything expected of me while my thoughts stayed somewhere else. At home, I laughed when I was supposed to, answered questions automatically, and pretended nothing had changed. But inside, I felt split, as if I were living two versions of myself that never fully aligned. I became hyper-aware of my husband in ways I hadn't been before. Every casual gesture, every careless comment, carried a new weight. I watched him closely, searching for signs that he knew something was wrong. He didn't. His ease made my guilt sharper, and I hated myself for resenting his innocence. The more normal he acted, the more unreal my own life felt. Messages continued, discreet and infrequent, but powerful enough to pull my attention away from everything else. I told myself I could stop responding anytime, yet I never did. Each reply felt like another small betrayal, easier than the last. The secrecy became routine, woven into my days so subtly that it scared me. I had never thought I was capable of this kind of deception, and realizing how naturally it came unsettled me. I started justifying my actions in quiet ways. I told myself I wasn't neglecting my marriage, that I was still present, still fulfilling my role. I argued internally that emotional connection wasn't the same as physical infidelity, even though I knew that line had already blurred. The excuses didn't erase the guilt, but they made it easier to live with, and that, too, frightened me. When we spoke again, the tone had shifted. There was no pretense of innocence anymore. We avoided discussing what had happened directly, yet it hung between us, shaping every word. I felt drawn to him in a way that went beyond desire. He had become someone I confided in, someone whose approval mattered more than it should have. That realization forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't just a mistake, it was becoming a bond. The risk started to feel real. I noticed how often my husband mentioned his friend in passing, how casually their lives intersected. Each mention sent a wave of anxiety through me. I imagined being discovered, not through dramatic confrontation, but through a careless detail I failed to hide. The fear of exposure followed me constantly, yet it wasn't enough to make me stop. At night, sleep became elusive. My mind replayed conversations, analyzed messages, and imagined different outcomes. I thought about ending everything abruptly, cutting off contact and pretending it had never happened. But the idea of losing that connection left me feeling hollow. I hated myself for needing something that threatened everything I already had. The emotional distance at home grew, though I tried desperately to conceal it. I found myself less patient, more distracted. I avoided deep conversations with my husband, afraid of what might surface if I let my guard down. He noticed the change, even if he didn't understand it. His concern made my chest tighten with a mixture of shame and defensiveness. Eventually, the pressure became impossible to ignore. He asked me directly if something was wrong, his tone careful, sincere. For a moment, I considered telling the truth, confessing everything and accepting whatever consequences followed. The words rose to my throat, heavy and urgent. But fear stopped me. I smiled, dismissed his concern, and changed the subject. Watching him accept my lie without question was worse than any accusation could have been. The imbalance in my life reached a breaking point when I realized how much space the secret occupied in my thoughts. It shaped my moods, my reactions, my sense of self. I no longer recognized the person I was becoming. The excitement that had once drawn me in now felt like a trap, tightening with every choice I made. When the friend asked to see me again, not casually but with intention, I knew avoidance was no longer an option. I had been postponing a decision, hoping circumstances would resolve themselves. They wouldn't. The situation demanded clarity, and I could feel it approaching, heavy and unavoidable. As I considered what to do next, one truth became painfully clear: continuing like this would destroy something, whether it was my marriage, my integrity, or both. I had tried to balance on a line that didn't exist, convincing myself I could control the outcome. Now, faced with the consequences of my own actions, I understood that neutrality was no longer possible. Whatever came next would define me, and I was terrified of what that definition might be. I agreed to meet him one last time, not because I wanted comfort, but because uncertainty had become unbearable. Carrying the secret had drained me, and I knew that avoiding a decision was no longer an option. I needed finality, even if it hurt. When we spoke, there was no softness left in my tone. I told him I couldn't continue like this, that whatever existed between us had reached a point where it demanded an answer. He listened without interrupting, his expression serious, stripped of the ease that once drew me in. He didn't try to romanticize what we had shared or dismiss it as meaningless. Instead, he acknowledged the weight of it, admitting that he had grown attached in ways he hadn't expected. Hearing that didn't comfort me. It confirmed how far things had gone, how deeply both of us had allowed this to take root. I told him I was tired of lying, tired of measuring every word and every glance. I admitted how much the guilt had changed me, how it had invaded my marriage and my sense of self. Speaking openly felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd been wearing for too long, but it also left me exposed. There was no relief without consequence. He asked what I wanted, not in a demanding way, but with genuine uncertainty. The question lingered longer than I expected. For weeks, I had convinced myself that I didn't have to answer it, that circumstances would decide for me. Now, faced with it directly, I realized how dangerous that thinking had been. Wanting two lives at once was not an option, no matter how carefully I tried to manage it. I spoke slowly, choosing honesty over comfort. I told him that what we felt was real, but it was built on secrecy and betrayal. No matter how intense it seemed, it couldn't exist without destroying something else. A relationship born from hidden moments would always carry the shadow of how it began. Saying it aloud made my chest ache, but it also brought clarity. He didn't argue. That silence felt like respect, and it hurt more than resistance would have. He admitted that he had imagined a future where things could be different, where feelings justified choices. But he also admitted that he knew the cost, even if he hadn't wanted to face it before. We were both standing in the aftermath of decisions already made, trying to salvage what remained of our integrity. The hardest part was acknowledging my responsibility. I couldn't blame loneliness, neglect, or circumstance without also admitting my own agency. I had chosen to answer the messages, chosen to return, chosen to let the connection deepen. Accepting that truth stripped away any remaining excuses. I wasn't a victim of temptation, I was an active participant. When I told him I was ending it, the finality of the words surprised me. They sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded, not in agreement, but in acceptance. There was sadness there, but also restraint. He didn't ask me to reconsider or promise that things would be different. In that moment, I respected him more for letting me go than I had during any of our shared silences. Walking away felt heavier than the first time, but it also felt honest. I knew the consequences wouldn't end there. Returning to my marriage meant facing the emotional distance I had created, whether through confession or quiet effort to repair what I had damaged. Neither option promised peace, only responsibility. In the days that followed, I sat with the discomfort rather than running from it. I noticed how fragile trust truly was, how easily it could be fractured without a single public act of betrayal. I also understood something I hadn't before: infidelity isn't defined by how far someone goes, but by how far they're willing to justify going. I didn't emerge from the experience unscathed or enlightened in any dramatic way. What I gained was a clearer understanding of myself, one that came at a painful cost.
I learned that desire doesn't excuse deception, and that emotional honesty requires courage long before temptation appears. The choice I made didn't erase what had happened, but it did draw a line I refused to cross again. Living with that decision meant carrying regret without letting it define my future. I had stepped into something forbidden and walked back out changed, aware that love, loyalty, and self-respect demand constant, conscious choices.